So in this video, we're going to discuss another objection to Mill's theory. Remember, Mill's theory says that an action is morally good to the extent that it increases happiness and bad to the extent that it decreases happiness, and that if the action's effect on happiness is the sole standard for evaluating actions, morally speaking. Last time we looked at two versions of a single objection to this view. This time we'll look at a different kind of objection. So here's the first instance of this kind of objection. Mill's theory says that we should maximize overall happiness. The theory therefore implies that harming a minority, e.g. by enslaving them, to make a majority happy is morally good if that's what maximizes happiness. But, the idea goes, harming a minority to make a majority happy can't be morally good. Enslaving people can't be morally good, even if it makes for the most overall happiness. Therefore, the theory is false. So this is an objection to Mill's theory. Now, we could call this the simple slaves objection because there'll be a more complex version of the objection momentarily. Here's Mill's response. He says, actually, it would be okay to enslave people, but it's a bad idea because it won't work. Why? Because we'll all fear being enslaved, and therefore people won't be very happy. That doesn't strike me as especially plausible, but let's look at another possible reply. It says, because we empathize, we'll sort of suffer with the slaves. So we won't really be happy, even though we think we are because we're being served. While it's true that humans have an amazing capacity for empathy, that most ordinary humans automatically empathize with people with whom they see suffering, there are a variety of ways you can block that tendency towards empathy, including starting to think of people in other groups as sort of fundamentally different from you. And maybe that would happen, plausibly that would happen. If you enslaved a group of people, you'd start to think of them as fundamentally different from you, and that might interfere with your ordinary mechanisms of empathy. So it's not clear that this reply is very effective either. Moreover, even if those replies were effective, they wouldn't stand up against the following objection. What if we make a secret slave society? So we secretly enslave a group of people. What I mean by that is we sort of take the slaves and stick them on an island, and they produce our food and so on and so forth. I mean, sticking them on an island doesn't really work. But let's say we take the whole Midwest, and we make that's where the slaves are, and we make sure that everybody outside of the Midwest doesn't know about slaves. So they just don't know there are slaves. The food appears, it seems to be magic. When your car appears, it seems to be magic. It just seems to come from nowhere. Or we create some fiction about some happy worker somewhere producing these things. Well, in that case, you wouldn't know there are slaves, so you wouldn't fear becoming a slave, nor would you suffer through your empathy because you wouldn't be empathizing with them because you wouldn't know about them. But it still seems, even in that case where having this minority enslaved creates the most overall happiness, that it's wrong to enslave the minority. So the idea goes, Mill's theory fails. Now there's a number of objections to Mill's theory that basically push the same point, and I'll give what I take to be a better response to this objection later, but only after running through all of the objections that basically work the same way. So this is called the organ harvesting objection. In the lower left there, we have somebody who needs a lung, and here we have somebody who needs a kidney, and we have a person who needs a liver, and somebody who needs a kidney, and somebody who needs a heart. So each of these people needs an organ transplant or will surely die. And here we have a utilitarian surgeon, and the utilitarian surgeon thinks to herself, if I don't operate, these patients will surely die. But if I do operate, they'll surely live. I'm just that good. But I need organs to give them. There's no organs in this sort of, in the lineup. These people are all going to die before their turn on the organ donor list comes up. So the surgeon sadly sort of thinks, I'll go on to my next appointment. And there we have a healthy patient. And the surgeon goes up to the healthy patient and thinks to herself, look, if I switch the organs from this healthy patient into these folks, so I take the kidneys and I stick them in these two, and I take the lungs and I stick them here, and I take the liver and stick it here, and take the heart and stick it here, then I'll save 5 lives and make for a lot of happiness, but only kill 1 life, so only decrease happiness by a comparatively smaller amount. And so the surgeon thinks, what should I do? Well, Mill's theory says I should harvest the organs from this healthy patient and redistribute them, thereby increasing happiness more than I would just by treating this ordinary healthy patient. Now, what's the objection? The objection is clearly this surgeon should not harvest the organs. That is not the morally correct thing to do. But Mill's theory says it is, therefore Mill's theory is false. And this is very similar to the slave objection. The slave objection says Mill's theory says to enslave people if that's going to make for the most overall happiness, but it wouldn't. But that's not morally good even if it would make for the most overall happiness, so Mill's theory is false. And here's another objection along the same lines. We can call this the justice objection. This is the one Mill develops his reply to most fully, but I'm just going to give you the gist. Imagine you have a judge here who thinks, I know the person I'm considering sentencing to life in prison is innocent, and I know it's unjust to sentence an innocent person to life in prison, so I know sentencing this person to life in prison would be immoral. But if I don't sentence this person to life in prison, people are going to riot because people believe this person is guilty, and that rioting will lead to looting and murders and so on and so forth. Moreover, if I sentence him to life in prison, people are going to be really, really happy because, again, they think he's guilty, they think he deserves it, and people like to see someone get what they deserve. So I really think that, given Mill's theory, that, given that there's going to be more overall suffering and less overall happiness if I don't sentence this person to life, then I should. But of course he's innocent, and it's got to be wrong to sentence an innocent person to life. So Mill's theory is false. And how does Mill reply? Well, he says, look, this objection makes sense only if we have a conception of justice that doesn't depend on happiness being our ultimate end. But we don't have any such conception, so this objection doesn't succeed. So what's the idea here? The idea is that the only reason we care about justice is because of its connection to happiness. When people see someone who they believe to be guilty, get punished, it makes them feel good. And when they see someone who they believe to be innocent get set free, it makes them feel good. So we get a sort of tick up in happiness when we see justice performed, and that's the only reason we care about justice. So in this particular case, if setting the innocent person free will lead to less happiness, and condemning the guilty person will lead to more happiness, that's what you should do. Okay. Now, here's a very different kind of reply to this objection. And this reply also covers the organ harvesting objection, and to some extent covers the slaves objection as well. And it's act versus rule utilitarianism. Mill advocates what's called act utilitarianism, but he didn't draw this distinction. This is a distinction that came later. So what is act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism? Well, let me just use a simple example. Suppose we have baby Hitler, and we know that if we kill baby Hitler as a baby, the world is going to be much better off. There's going to be much more overall happiness and less overall suffering than there will be if we allow Hitler to go on to adulthood. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that that's a historically accurate claim. It may well be that even without Hitler, we would have ended up with Nazi Germany being more or less the way it was. The point here isn't to make the historical claim that had we killed Hitler, things would have gone better. It's just to say this. Supposing it's true that had we killed Hitler, things would have gone better. We would have had more overall happiness and less overall suffering. Well, the act utilitarian says the moral worth of an act is to be measured by the consequences of that particular act. So in this case, since killing baby Hitler would lead to more overall happiness than letting baby Hitler live, the morally correct thing to do, according to the act utilitarian, is to kill baby Hitler. The rule utilitarian says the moral worth of an action is not to be measured by the consequences of that particular action. Instead, the moral worth of an action is to be measured by the consequences that actions of that kind typically have. Now notice the moral worth of an action is still measured by the consequences, but it's not measured by the consequences of the particular act, the ones they happen to have, but rather by the consequences that acts of that kind typically have. So when you're deciding whether to kill baby Hitler, what you have to ask is, does killing babies in general bring about more happiness or more suffering? And the answer is it tends to bring about more suffering, so killing babies is wrong, and that means killing this particular baby is wrong. You can do the same thing with the justice case. So sentencing innocent people in general does not bring about more happiness, so sentencing this particular innocent person is wrong. Harvesting healthy people's organs and redistributing them in general would not bring about more happiness, so it would bring about more suffering. So in general, doing that, so doing that in any particular case is wrong, even if in a particular case it would lead to more happiness. Enslaving people in general, or to put it slightly more, maybe harder to understand, but accurate way, if you look at the distribution of worlds that have slaves, those versus those without slaves, those with slaves will tend to be less happy than those without slaves. So when you're deciding whether to enslave people or not, it's wrong to enslave them because it tends to lead to less happiness than not enslaving people. Mill seems to advocate act utilitarianism, but again, I think that's because the distinction hadn't been drawn. He was developing a theory that was undeveloped. And after that theory became developed, people were able to draw the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism. At any rate, Mill seems to advocate act utilitarianism, but you should note that a lot of these problems either go away or lose some force if you switch to rule utilitarianism. Okay, now for the final objection. The final objection goes like this. The happiest world is one in which we all live like pigs, seeking satisfaction of our basest desires. But clearly that's not the morally best world, even though Mill's theory will say it is. So the happiest world is not the morally best world, so Mill's theory is false. Mill offers the following reply. He says, look, it's just not true that the happiest world is one in which we live like pigs seeking satisfaction of our basest sensory desires, because intellectual desires are just objectively better and qualitatively better than sensory desires. To say they're qualitatively better means this: no amount of sensory satisfaction, no amount of satisfying your sensory desires can compare to even a small amount of intellectual pleasure. And when you put it this way, it sounds silly. It sounds like Mill's bizarre childhood, which we talked about in class, is influencing his view, this sort of very academic-y childhood, this very intellectual childhood is making him think that the intellectual is more valuable than the sensory. And that's just a contingent feature of Mill's psychology. Get rid of that feature and everybody would see that, yes, maximizing your sensory desires is going to be better than getting a small amount of intellectual pleasure. And at first that seems right, but notice this. Imagine you're given the choice between living your life with all of your sensory desires satisfied, but you're not allowed to have any intellectual desires satisfied. So things like friendship, understanding, these are all stripped away. One way to sort of make this plain is to say, imagine you could trade your life for the life of the happiest possible pig. It's not that your psychology, as it is with all your rich intellect, gets put into a pig. It's rather that all of those aspects of your psychology that involve your intellect go away, and you get sort of the sensory life of a pig, and you're the happiest pig in the world because your sensory satisfaction is maximal. So you're just given as much sensory satisfaction as you can get, as much food as you want, and so on and so forth. Well, Mill says, clearly, if you're choosing between that life, the life of the happiest possible pig, and your own life, which is a mixed bag as far as satisfaction of sensory desires go, sometimes you're hungry, sometimes you're satiated, and so on and so forth, but does have some intellectual pleasure, he says you're going to choose your own life, the one with some intellectual pleasure. And this indicates that you value intellectual pleasure more than a sort of infinite amount of mere sensory pleasure. And I think there's something to that. As a matter of fact, when you present this to people, most people do say they would choose their own life over the life of the most satisfied possible pig. Okay, we'll stop there.